So I thought this would be a good shirt to wear for JBL. It may contain nuts because JBL brought out the Extreme 2, which was 20 watts on battery compared to the Extreme 1 on 30 watts for battery when it came out. So Extreme 2 wasn't quite as extreme as the name would suggest. But JBL being JBL, they brought out a firmware update to fix some bugs. So nothing about power limits and nothing about changing the actual sound itself of the JBL Extreme 2 speaker. And lo and behold, these bugs fixed the 20 watt limit to 30 watt limit. So it was nearly as loud, or on average louder than the Extreme 1 on battery. And lo and behold, it changed the sound. There was more bass. It wasn't so much high end, wasn't so much clarity, but it was more like the Extreme 1 in the overall sound. Then apparently people had problems with the firmware 1.6. They had to withdraw it, and they've come out with the firmware 1.9. So people are asking me, have you tried the 1.9? And until now I hadn't tried it. I've now tried it because people are worried. It says bugs fixed. Now if you go into your JBL app, you fire up your app, you see the red dot, you go in where it says there's an update available. It tells you, click on here, will tell you what that update does, and it says bugs fixed and addresses hands-free issues. Nothing about power limits, nothing about changes of sound, but we've been there before with JBL. They say that, but then they change the sound and they change fundamentals of the speaker. So people are a bit worried about doing the firmware update, not least because on some JBL speakers, firmware updates have completely bricked the speaker. A lot of JBL Charge 3s going from Connect to Connect Plus, that update has bricked their speaker. So can be a little bit wary of updates with JBL. However, in the interests of getting the information out there, I have tried the firmware 1.9 and I can now tell you exactly where we are with the latest firmware update that doesn't change the speaker in any way other than fix bugs, apparently. And here are my quick sample clips, 47% volume and maximum volume. Has anything changed? So the big question is there any difference in loudness between firmware 1.6, firmware 1.9 in terms of how loud it goes on battery? And basically they do go to the same loudness. I measured them. The average loudness is exactly the same. In terms of peaks, there's a slight difference and an advantage to firmware 1.6. And when I look at my graphs, it's obvious why. It's because On firmware 1.9, you do lose a little bit of bass. It's only a little bit, maybe a decibel, but it's definite. So if you look at maximum volume, 1.9 is peaking around 70-ish into the 75 mark, and it's just under 20 decibels. 1.6 is going almost to minus 19 decibels, so that's 1 decibel louder. It's slightly more even. Now, it's all subtle, it's all slight, but it's definite. So as it goes a little bit deeper before it really rolls off, so around 60 hertz, but it's a steeper roll off here from 70 hertz. So it's subtle. They've done something, but overall, you won't hear a difference in loudness. They haven't removed the limit which they took off to start with. So you're not back to 20 watt limits that you were on. You're still on your 30 watt limit. However, they've tweaked the sound again. There's a little bit lost off the bass. That means you've lost a little bit of the peak, which still wasn't as much as the Extreme 1 to start with. So you've lost a little bit of ground again to the Extreme 1. And it's all subtle. Now look at the very, very high end as you go towards 20,000 hertz, which, you know, you're going to need good hearing if you can hear it. But again, there's a slight reduction there when you go from 1.6, 1.9. So they've tweaked the very high end for whatever reason. You've lost it if you could even hear it. You know, there's an argument there. The only bit you've gained, they've tweaked something in the mid-range, around 600 hertz. Now, it's hard to see, but if you follow this really closely, for instance, so this peak here, around 550 hertz, is just over the minus 21 decibel on 1.6. You know, it's hitting minus 20, so 1 decibel louder on that little peak. And it's only subtle, but if you follow this mid-range, you will see that it's definite. And I'm not saying, oh, well, on just on this one recording. On several recordings, it's consistent. But I'm just showing you this particular recording because it's a good example. For instance, again, around 700 hertz or so, just that spike on the 1.6 above minus 36, you know, 1.5 decibels maybe louder on the firmware 1.9. So you're gaining a little bit in sound if you can hear it on the mid-range. You're losing at the very, very, very high end, and you're definitely losing a bit of bass. That's the weird bit here, is they've tweaked that bass again. Everybody wants a bigger bass, although not me personally, but I have to say most people just want a bigger bass, a bigger slam. You've lost a little bit off of that bass at maximum. So then the question is, what's it like at the other volume steps? Is it still the same or is it different? So 47% volume. And I have to say, it's the exact same story. Obviously, you've got more bass because, you know, you're losing a lot of bass as you go up to maximum volume. But the relative differences are the same. You're still going a little bit deeper on the bass, maybe 5 hertz for firmware 1.6. And it's a slightly louder peak by about a decibel compared to firmware 1.9. So that's 1.9. That's 1.6, and it's a clear decibel, slightly deeper before it rolls off. So it's consistent, whether it's maximum volume, mid-volume, wherever you are, the differences are the same. You've got the same difference at the very, very, very high end. You've lost a little bit, but, you know, again, you will argue whether you could even hear that at all because of where it is in the spectrum. But you definitely, again, they are definitely tweaking the mid-range. You can see it's quite obvious, like AB, you can see it's a slightly stronger mid-range. The way it's peaking is slightly different, it's slightly stronger on 1.9. I'm saying the mid-range, you know, that's like 300 to 5,000 hertz. This is around 400 to 1,000 hertz mark where they seem to have really tweaked it. So that's the basic difference. The only thing most people are really going to care about is that, yes, you have lost a little bit off the bass. You haven't lost anything off the overall average loudness that it will go, but the 1.6 will peak about a decibel louder than the 1.9. So there we are again. The JBL firmware update, it says bugs fixed and nothing else apart from the hands-free. And indeed, there is a little bit more tinkering with the sound signature. Now, you know, you can argue it's subtle, but just above subtle to the point of, yeah, there is an obvious change. You know, 1 decibel in bass and a little less deep in that bass, you know, albeit 5 hertz, 1 decibel, that you can hear that difference. Now it's subtle, but you can hear it. You know, the difference at the high end, you'd argue whether you can hear it or not, but it's there. They've taken a tad off the very, very extreme high end. They've tinkered again with the mid-range. They have changed the sound. Whether that's a byproduct of something else they fixed in there, who can really say? But I mean, given what happened with the firmware 1.6, you'd have to say it was, you know, the changes were pretty major. That's not a side effect of a bug fix, is it? And quite honestly, with 1.6, even if it was the side effect of raising the battery limit in somehow, they should warn you, this will change the amount of bass you get, will change the amount of clarity you get. So yeah, people are saying full marks to JBL coming out with these quick firmware updates, but on the other hand, need to be a bit more upfront exactly what they're doing with these firmware updates, to be quite honest with you. Bugs fixed. I mean, normally you'd still get a list of what those bugs were, but you don't with the JBL firmware updates. So yeah, that was my quick video to just say what my experience was with the firmware update. And I have to say, you do get a variance on opinions when it comes to firmware updates. I'm talking generally amongst their speakers, and it's pretty clear that, you know, along the generation of a speaker, they have different hardware versions of the same speaker, and depending on what hardware version you get, the firmware update will affect it in a different way. So it's not always consistent. You know, 2 people saying, oh, I did the firmware update, and then 2 people say they noticed 2 different things. One may notice very little, someone else say, yep, it's changed the sound a hell of a lot. I'm pretty sure a lot of it can be explained by the hardware version of the speaker you get. Now, you'd imagine there weren't that many different Extreme 2s out there, but it is possible because some people seem to have had a big difference with the firmware 1.9, and some people are saying they didn't notice any difference at all. Could be just people's hearing, what you're listening to, what kind of tracks you're listening to. But my theory is they do different versions, not only different versions, it seems geographically these speakers can vary quite a bit. So yeah, that's just so I'm not going to say that's what's going to happen with your speaker. I'm saying that's what happened with my speaker. And you know, take that on board when you're thinking about doing your firmware 1.9. You're going to lose a bit of bass if you've got the same hardware version, geographical version in the UK that I have for the Extreme 2. Thank you for watching.
UK